The number I was counting was breaths. Not money, not days, not the hours left before my shift started, or the miles left in my gas tank, or the balance in my checking account, which I already knew without looking because zero doesn't change between glances. I had stopped counting those things 2 nights ago, because counting them didn't produce different answers, and all it did was use up energy I didn't have. So I counted breaths, mine, then Isaiah's, then Nala's, then back to mine. It was 11:47 p.m. on the 9th night. I know the exact time because I had just checked my phone, not for messages, not for anything, just to see the numbers, and then set it face down on the passenger seat the way I always did when I needed to stop looking at it. The parking lot of Greater Hope Baptist Church on Lamar Avenue was quiet. There were 2 other cars in the lot, both parked near the side entrance. Neither of them had moved in the 3 hours I'd been watching. My 3 children were asleep in the back of my 2007 Honda Accord. I had folded the rear seats down 3 weeks ago and never put them back up. Nala and Isaiah were curled together under the heaviest blanket I owned, a fleece thing I'd bought at Target 2 Christmases before, the one with a pattern of little pine trees that Nala called the forest blanket. Zion was in the front passenger seat, head tipped against the window, finally asleep after midnight, which meant he'd been awake with me again until almost the end, and neither of us had said so. Isaiah had been coughing since night 4. Not a bad cough, not the kind that scares you, just the kind that settles in and stays, the wet chest kind, the kind that sounds worse at night when the air inside a closed car gets cold and thin and doesn't circulate the way it should. I had given him the last of the children's Tylenol 3 nights ago. I had been warming the car for 20-minute intervals through the night engine on, heat up, then off again to save gas. And that was the system, and the system was all I had. I was counting his breaths when I heard the knock. 3 taps on the driver's side window. Not aggressive. Not the way a cop knocks when they want you to understand they mean business. Not the way someone bangs when they want to startle you. 3 deliberate taps and then nothing. And then I heard a voice through the glass. I'm not here to bother you. I'm going to step back so you can see me. I sat up straight. My hand went to the door lock without me telling it to. It just went, the way a body moves when it's been running on hypervigilance for 9 days, and every shadow outside the window is something to assess before it becomes something to react to. I pressed lock. I looked through the fog on the glass. A man, standing 6 feet back from the car, the way he said he would, both hands raised to about shoulder height, palms facing out. He was wearing a dark jacket, work clothes. Nothing that said anything specific except that he had been somewhere intentional before he was here. He wasn't moving. He wasn't reaching for anything. He was just standing with his hands up in the particular posture of someone who has done this before and knows what it requires. I cracked the window 1 inch. The cold air came through first. Then his voice, quieter than I expected from a man his size. I'm not asking if you're okay. I can see you're not okay. He paused. I'm asking how long. I want to stop here for a second. I want to tell you something before I tell you what happened next. I have been asked a lot of questions in my life. I'm 32 years old. I work as a licensed practical nurse. I have been asked questions by doctors and administrators and case managers and social workers and the woman at the WIC office who looks at you like she's doing math every time you come in. I have been asked how I'm doing by people who were already looking past me when they asked. I have been asked if I needed help by people who had already decided the answer was no. Nobody had asked me how long. Not in 9 days. Not in the weeks before those 9 days, when everything was falling apart and I was going to work and taking care of other people's parents and telling myself it was going to work out. Nobody asked the specific question. They asked the general one, the one that requires a general answer, the one where fine is always acceptable, and 9 nights in a car with 3 kids and a sick baby and $20 is not something you put on another person. How long is different? How long is someone who already knows the answer is not fine? How long is someone who looked at my car and looked at the fog on my windows and did the kind of math that produces a real number? It broke something open in me that I had been holding together with both hands. I looked at him through that 1-inch gap, and I thought about lying. I am good at lying when I need to protect my children. I have been lying to my children for 9 nights about camping and adventures and bears who host forest parties. But this man was not my children. And the way he was standing there with his hands up, patient, waiting, like the answer mattered, and he wasn't going anywhere until he heard it. I couldn't make my mouth form the lie. 9 nights, I said. He nodded once. Like that was information and not a tragedy. Like I had told him something useful rather than something shameful. He looked at the car for a moment, not at me, at the car, and then he looked back at me. You got somewhere to go tomorrow? I said, no. He nodded again. Give me a few minutes. He walked back across the parking lot toward a black SUV parked near the church entrance that I hadn't noticed because I had been watching the other direction. He opened the rear passenger door and leaned in, and I watched him from my cracked window, and I thought about pulling out of the lot. I thought about it seriously for about 30 seconds. Starting the engine, putting it in reverse, driving to the Walmart lot on Getwell that I'd used on nights 2 and 3 before the security guard came. I didn't move. I don't know exactly why. Something about the way he had stood there with his hands up. Something about the way he had asked a question that assumed I was a real person with a real answer rather than a situation to be managed. I turned back to the rear seat. Isaiah was still breathing. Slower now. More even. Nala had her arm across his chest the way she always did when she slept, like even unconscious she was looking after him. Zion's head was still against the passenger window, his breath making a small cloud on the glass that appeared and faded and appeared again. 9 nights. If you asked me, right now, to describe what 9 nights in a car feels like, I would tell you it doesn't feel like what you probably imagine it feels like. You're probably imagining something cinematic darkness, fear, the weight of hopelessness, sitting on your chest like a physical thing. And there's some of that. There was plenty of that on night 6, when Isaiah's fever hit 101, and I held him on my lap in the driver's seat until 5 a.m. waiting for the Tylenol to work, knowing I couldn't take him to a hospital, knowing I couldn't miss another shift. But mostly, what 9 nights in a car feels like is administration. It feels like a list of problems that have to be solved in a specific order before you can sleep. And then you can't sleep anyway because sleeping means not watching. And not watching is a luxury that takes a form of safety I didn't have. It feels like organizing everything twice, once in the daylight when you can see what you're doing, and once in the dark when the kids are awake and asking questions, and you need your voice to stay steady while your hands find things by feel. It feels like being the only adult in a situation that requires 2 adults, except that's not a new feeling. That's just my life. The car just made it louder. I am telling you this because I need you to understand who I was before I tell you what happened next. I was not a woman waiting to be saved. I was a woman who had been solving problems alone for 2 years, and I was very close to the end of what that was possible on, but I was still solving. I was still in the driver's seat. I was still showing up. What I needed was not a hero. What I needed was someone to ask, how long? And then something to do with the answer. Before I tell you what that man said when he came back, drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, because I want to know you're out there. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. This is going to take a while, and I'm not going to skip the parts that matter. His name, I would find out later, was CJ. He worked as a driver. He had grown up in South Memphis, 3 miles from the church parking lot where we were standing. He had been in the foster care system from age 7 to age 18. He had slept in places that were not built for sleeping more times than he would ever count out loud. He was not a billionaire. He was not a hero. He was the man who drove the car. And what he came back across that parking lot to tell me, at 11:52 p.m. on the 9th night, was going to begin something that none of us, not me, not him, not the man sitting in the back of that black SUV who I hadn't even seen yet, could have planned or predicted or named. He walked back. He stopped 3 feet from my window. His hands were at his sides this time. Easy. Like whatever he was about to say, he was at peace with saying. and I sat there with my hands on the wheel of a car that hadn't moved in 4 hours, with my children breathing behind me, with 9 nights of cold and exhaustion and pride and terror pressed against the inside of my chest. And I waited to hear what a stranger standing in a church parking lot in Memphis at midnight thought could possibly help. The apartment on Fraser Boulevard had a leak under the kitchen sink that the super had promised to fix 6 times in 2 years and never did. I want to start there because I want you to understand what I mean when I say I had a home. It was not a perfect home. The carpet in the hallway was the original carpet from whenever the building was last renovated, which must have been sometime in the 90s, because it had that specific flatness of carpet that has been walked on by too many people for too long. The heating unit in the second bedroom made a knocking noise every time the temperature outside dropped below 45, which Nala named Harold and talked about like he was a pet. There was a stain on the living room wall that I covered with a poster of a national park I'd never been to and would probably never go to, but it was a good poster and it did the job. It was ours. $820 a month. 2 bedrooms. A kitchen where the morning sun came in at the right angle between October and February and made the whole room golden for exactly 45 minutes before the building next door cut it off. That kitchen is what I miss most, if I'm being honest. Not the space. It wasn't a big kitchen. I miss the way Zion smelled like his cereal in the mornings before school. That specific combination of Kid Sweat and Lucky Charms and whatever soap I could afford that week. I miss Nala's drawings on the refrigerator door held up with alphabet magnets, the kind that come in a mesh bag from Dollar General. All the letters mixed up so you had to sort through them to spell anything. She drew everything. Butterflies, houses, families in front yards, with trees that looked like lollipops on sticks. She had a specific way of drawing the sun. Not a circle, but a square with triangles coming off each corner. I never asked her why. I should have asked her why. I miss Isaiah at 13 months old, pulling himself up on the edge of the coffee table and looking at me like he had just discovered the whole point of having legs. Like standing up was the best thing that had ever happened to anyone, and he was personally responsible for inventing it. That was my life. That was what I was trying to hold. The math of it went like this. $17.40 an hour as a licensed practical nurse, which sounds like more than it is until you run it through 40 hours a week, which was never actually 40 hours, because I was also the person who covered open shifts when nobody else would, because I needed the money, then subtract taxes, then subtract $650 a month for Isaiah's daycare, because Nala and Zion were in school, but Isaiah needed somewhere to go. And the waiting list for the subsidized program was 14 months long when I put our names on it and was still going when everything fell apart, then subtract $820 for rent, then subtract the car payment that I was already 2 months behind on, then subtract utilities, which in Memphis in summer are not a minor thing, then subtract the minimum on the credit card I'd opened during the year Marcus left to cover the gap between what came in and what needed to go out. What was left after all of that was not enough to absorb anything unexpected. And life with 3 children is nothing but unexpected. I bought things one at a time at the dollar store. 1 bottle of shampoo, 1 can of soup, 1 roll of paper towels, not the 4-pack. I ate oatmeal for dinner 3 nights a week, not because I was pretending it was a choice, just because oatmeal was the number that made the other numbers work. I had a winter coat that closed at the collar, but had a broken zipper at the bottom third. So every winter, I wore it and held the open part shut with my left hand when the wind was bad. I told myself I'd replace it every year. I never replaced it. None of this was invisible to Zion. I want to say that clearly because it matters. Children are observers. They notice. Zion noticed that I skipped dinner when he thought I wasn't watching. He noticed when I checked my phone with a specific expression that he learned, somewhere around age 8, meant a bill was due and the money wasn't there. He never said so. He just watched, and he carried what he saw, and he didn't talk about it. That's the thing about 10-year-olds who have learned early that silence is a form of protection. They protect you with it, whether you want them to or not. Marcus left when Isaiah was 5 months old. I will tell you what actually happened, because I'm tired of the version where he's a monster, not because he deserves protecting, but because the truth is more useful than the simple story. He was not a bad man. He was a frightened one. 3 children, 1 income that was never sufficient, bills that multiplied faster than either of us could address them, and a particular kind of fear that communicates itself not through confrontation, but through disappearance. He told me the pressure was too much. He said he needed to figure himself out. He left on a Sunday in October. Isaiah still smelling like that specific newborn smell that I would have given anything to hold on to, and he didn't come back. He gave me the apartment. He paid 3 months of rent after he left before he stopped. He sent Isaiah a birthday card. When Isaiah turned 2, the envelope had his old handwriting on it, the big looping letters I used to tease him about, and inside was a card with a picture of a dog on it and a $20 bill folded in half. Isaiah carried that card around for 3 days, calling it Da Dog. That was the last communication. Isaiah is 3 now. He doesn't remember the card. I spent 6 days being angry. Then I had a broken vacuum cleaner and a shift starting at 6 a.m. and 3 children who needed things. And anger is a luxury that requires time I did not have. So I set it down and I kept moving. For almost 2 years, that was enough. Not comfortable, not without fear, but enough. Then the landlord sold the building on a Tuesday in September. The notice was taped to my door when I got home from a 12-hour shift. A single sheet of paper in a plastic sleeve. Like the formality of the sleeve made it more official. Like it needed to announce itself as serious. The new development company had purchased the property. The building would undergo renovation. All tenants were required to vacate within 30 days. No exceptions, no extensions. A phone number to call for information that, when I called it twice, rang through to a voicemail box that was full. 30 days. I called every affordable listing in Memphis over the following week. I made 43 calls. I wrote them down in the Notes app on my phone with the date and the number and the outcome. No answer, no available units, waiting list, minimum income requirement not met, first month, plus last month, plus security deposit required at signing. The minimum for anything with 2 bedrooms and working heat was $3,400. And that was the floor some places wanted more. I had $312 in my checking account. I had borrowed from my sister Lydia, who had sent me $200 from a check she'd been saving and couldn't afford to give. I had borrowed from my coworker Deja, who had less than Lydia, and sent me $75 anyway. I had told the situation in careful terms to the woman who ran the aid ministry at my mother's church in Bartlett, and 3 weeks later, an envelope appeared in my mailbox with $80 inside it, and a note card in someone's handwriting, not typed, handwritten, that said, "God sees you, baby." $80, $75, $200. A note card that made me stand at my mailbox for 4 minutes because I didn't trust what my face was doing. There was no one left to call after that. I had run the entire length of my network and come out the other end with nothing but love and about $355 in additions to the $312 I already had. And $3,400 was the number that sat between me and a roof. I loaded the car on a Tuesday night, the last night of the month. The Honda had 162,000 miles on it. The dashboard had a crack running across the right side that had been there since before Zion started school. There was rust along the wheel wells and a slow exhaust leak and a passenger side mirror that was held in place by a strip of electrical tape that I replaced every 6 months when it started to peel. It ran. That was its primary virtue. It ran. I folded the back seats down flat. I layered blankets, the forest blanket first, because it was the heaviest, then a gray throw from the bedroom, then a quilt Lydia had given me when Zion was born. I packed 3 backpacks, one for each child, specific to what each one needed: snacks and a change of clothes. And in Nala's, the small sketchbook she carried everywhere. I put the children's Tylenol in the side pocket of my own bag where I could reach it without turning on the light. I put the phone charger and the car charger and the flashlight where I could find them in the dark. Then I stood in the empty apartment for 3 minutes. Just stood there, in the hallway between the living room and the kitchen, with the lights still on, looking at the shape of the rooms, Harold's corner where the heating unit was, the poster of the national park over the stain on the wall, the kitchen where the morning sun came in at the right angle for 45 minutes. 3 minutes isn't long, but I needed them. Then I turned off the lights, locked the door behind me, and slid the key under the building super's door. I told the kids we were going camping. Nala screamed, not out of fear, out of pure 7-year-old joy, the kind that doesn't ask questions because questions would slow it down. Like real camping? Yes, baby, just like real camping. Zion stood on the sidewalk with his backpack on and watched me finish loading the trunk, and he didn't say a word, not one. And I looked at him once, just once, quickly, and I looked away. Because there are some things you can only hold if you don't look at them directly. Isaiah clapped because Nala was happy. At 3 years old, that was all the information he needed. I drove to the church lot on Lamar. I found a spot near the back, close enough to the street to feel less exposed. I cut the engine. The heat was gone in minutes, and I sat in the driver's seat on the first night, and I told myself, just tonight, we'll figure something out by morning. Morning came. I figured nothing out. I drove to work with my 3 children asleep in the back, parked behind the hospital in the employee lot, walked inside and put my badge on and my scrubs on, and I spent that shift caring for 17 patients who had no idea that the woman checking their blood pressure had slept in a parking lot the night before. I washed my hands at the sink in room 114 and looked at myself in the mirror above it for exactly 2 seconds. And then I went back out into the hallway and I did my job. There is a specific kind of quiet that happens after your children fall asleep in a car. It is not peaceful quiet. It is the quiet of a held breath. The quiet of someone who has been performing for 3 hours and has finally gotten off stage. You stop moving. You stop talking. You stop being the version of yourself that makes everything sound like an adventure, and the cold sound like camping, and the parking lot sound like the woods, and you sit there in the dark, and you are just yourself again, and yourself is exhausted and frightened and running through numbers that don't add up. That was night 1. I sat in the driver's seat and listened to Nala breathe. Then Isaiah. Then back to Nala. I checked my mirrors every few minutes left, center, right. Not because I expected to see anything, but because having a system helped me stay present. The lot was empty, except for us, and 2 other vehicles near the far end that didn't move. A streetlight on the corner of Lamar made a yellow circle on the wet asphalt. A dog barked twice, somewhere east of us, and then stopped. Zion did not sleep. He sat in the passenger seat with his backpack on his lap, and he looked out the window the way he looked out windows. On long drives, not at anything specific, just at the passing of things, except nothing was passing. We weren't moving. He was watching a still parking lot at 11 o'clock at night like it was scenery worth studying. He never asked me why we were there. Not once during the whole process of loading the car. Not during the drive. Not during the bear story I'd told the younger 2. He just watched. He sat with his backpack on his lap and he watched, and I kept my voice steady and my hands busy, and we both pretended that the other one didn't know what we knew. At some point close to midnight, he turned to look at me. I don't know exactly what I looked like. Tired, holding it together in the way that comes apart at the edges when you're not watching it. He looked at me for a moment, and then he looked back out the windshield, and he said, quietly enough that I could pretend not to hear it if I needed to, "This is a nice camping spot, Mom." I've thought about that sentence every day since. He was 10 years old. He was telling me that he knew, and that he wasn't going to say so. He was giving me the gift of his silence, the same silence I had given him by not making him watch me fall apart, and he was offering it back to me in 5 words wrapped up as a camping opinion. 10 years old, and already fluent in every language that has no words in it. I said, "Yeah, baby, it's a good one." He nodded. He pulled the extra blanket from behind his seat, the gray throw, and wrapped it around himself, and tilted his head against the window. He was asleep in 11 minutes. I know, because I counted. Then I was alone in the way you're alone, when other people are present but unreachable. And I sat there until 4 a.m. running the math I had already run 100 times that week, looking for the number that was different, looking for the version where it worked. The second night was colder. I moved the car to a different lot, not the church again, not 2 nights in a row, because I had already made a rule for myself without naming it as a rule. Never get predictable. Predictable was how you got noticed, and getting noticed was a kind of danger I wasn't equipped to handle. I found a Walmart on Getwell Road with a wide lot and ambient light, and the kind of steady overnight traffic that makes one parked car invisible. I picked a spot in the middle section, away from the entrance, but not against the back fence, where the light didn't reach. Same routine. Blankets arranged the same way. The bear story. This time the bear was teaching the squirrels to bake a cake, and it went wrong in increasingly specific ways until Nala was laughing hard enough to hiccup, and Isaiah had no idea why he was clapping, but clapped anyway. They were out by 9:30. At 2 in the morning, Isaiah woke up crying. Not the kind that meant he was hungry or startled or wanted attention. The kind that started low in his chest and built like something was tightening inside him. I knew that cry. Every mother knows the specific atlas of their child's cries. Each one a different territory, each one with its own rules. This one said, cold, real cold. The kind that gets into small bones faster than it gets into adult ones, because there isn't as much insulation between the blood and the air. I had one jacket, a navy blue puffer I'd bought at Goodwill 3 winters before. The zipper worked at the top and the bottom, but the middle section had been broken so long I'd stopped noticing. I had been wearing it every night to keep my core temperature from dropping to the point where I couldn't think. I took it off. I tucked it around Isaiah, under him, over him, up around his ears, until he was wrapped inside it completely. A small, warm package in my old jacket. His crying slowed, then stopped. His breathing leveled out. I sat in the driver's seat without a coat until the sun came up. The third night was the one that changed the system. I was back at the Walmart lot, a different section, when a man in a security jacket came to the driver's window at 11:15. Private security from the commercial property east of the lot. He was not unkind, that's important to say. He wasn't threatening. He just told me the lot was private property and asked me to move along. I moved. I drove for 12 minutes trying to remember every parking lot I'd passed in the last week, categorizing them the way I categorized medications. By safety profile, by duration of likely effectiveness, by contraindications. I ended up at a grocery store on Raleigh-Millington that closed at midnight and had a back section with one working light and no visible cameras. I pulled in. Then I had to reorganize. 3 sleeping children. 1 cramped back seat that I had optimized over 2 nights for a specific configuration. The angle of the gray throw. The position of Isaiah against Nala. The backpack that served as Zion's headrest in the passenger seat. I had to do all of it again in the dark, working around the children, moving things by feel, keeping my movements slow enough not to wake them. Nala stirred when I adjusted the blanket. I froze. She sighed and settled. I waited 30 seconds, and then kept moving. By the time I had everything reorganized, it was 12:40, and I had given up on sleeping for that night. I sat in the driver's seat and I just watched. Not the mirrors this time. I watched the grocery store's backloading dock. The way the light moved across the asphalt as clouds passed over the parking lot lights. The slow arrival of a delivery truck at 2 a.m. that idled for 10 minutes and then left. I watched everything, and I protected my children with my eyes because it was the only thing I had left that was unlimited. After that night, I stopped trying to sleep. Work on day 4 started like every other day, 6 a.m., employee entrance, locker room on the 3rd floor. I kept a rotation of clean scrubs in the trunk in a sealed bag. I had learned, somewhere around day 2, that the employee shower on the 2nd floor was available before shift, technically for overnight staff, and that if you arrived early enough and moved quietly enough, no one asked questions. I arrived at 5:15. I showered, I dressed. I was at my first patient's door at 6:02. My supervisor Janet caught me in the hallway at 9. She had a specific expression she deployed when something was off with a staff member. Not concern exactly, more like calibration. Like she was taking a reading and deciding whether it required action. She looked at me for a moment longer than normal. She said, "How are you holding up, Tamara?" I said, "Good. Little tired. Zion had a rough night." She nodded. She kept moving. I kept moving. Isaiah's cough had deepened by the 3rd day, settling from the top of his chest into the bottom of it, which was the direction I didn't want it to go. I knew what it needed: a warm, dry room, a humidifier, 10 days of antibiotics if it was bacterial, possibly a chest x-ray to rule out pneumonia. I knew this the same way I knew every medication interaction on my patient care list that week clinically, completely, with no room for uncertainty. I also knew what I didn't have: the copay, the time off, the address to give the pediatric clinic that wasn't a parking lot. So I managed it. More Tylenol, more warmth from the engine heat in intervals, more of my body heat pressed against his at night through the jacket I'd given him and gotten back during the days. On night 5, Nala asked the question I had been waiting for. We had eaten granola bars and apple juice for dinner in the car. I'd bought a box at Dollar General that morning, the kind with the oats pressed into rectangles with honey, which Nala called rectangle cookies and considered a treat. Isaiah had eaten half of his and fallen asleep with the other half in his hand. I was doing the gentle extraction of a granola bar from the fist of a sleeping 3-year-old, which is a specific operation that requires patience and a steady hand, when Nala looked up from her sketchbook and said, "Mom, when are we going home?" I finished the extraction. I set the granola bar on the console. I looked at Nala in the rearview mirror, her face in the dim light, pencil still in her hand, looking at me the way children look at their mothers when they actually want the answer and not the reassurance. "Soon, baby," I said. "We're just on a little adventure right now." She thought about this. Is the adventure going to be over before school? Because I have library day on Thursday and I need to return my book. Before I could say anything, Zion's voice came from the passenger seat, quiet and even. "It'll be over before school." Nala accepted this. She went back to her drawing. She drew something in the dark using the faint glow of a streetlight 4 spots away, and I didn't ask what it was. I sat in the driver's seat, and I looked at the back of Zion's head, and I understood something that I didn't have a word for then. And still don't. Entirely. He was 10 years old. He was lying on my behalf. For my sake. To protect his sister from a truth that was also his own truth. And he was doing it with a steadiness that I was no longer sure I had earned. I had asked him to carry too much. I had never asked him to carry anything. I had just started a life in which the weight distributed itself, and some of it landed on him because he was the oldest and the steadiest and the one who watched. And he had picked it up and carried it without being asked, the way children do when they love someone who is struggling, and they don't have any other way to help. By night 5, I had stopped praying for anything specific. I had stopped making plans past the next 6 hours. I was in pure management mode, one interval to the next, one task to the next, one night to the next, because that was the only scale at which the math was survivable. And then night 6 arrived, and it arrived with a fever. As a nurse, I have taken more temperatures than I could count. I know exactly what 101.3 means in a body that is not my child's. It means the immune system is working, it means watchful waiting, it means fluids and rest and possibly a follow-up. It means manageable. In the clinical register of my training, 101.3 is not an emergency. In the back seat of a Honda Accord in a grocery store parking lot at 3 a.m. with no heat running and a box of children's Tylenol, I was already shaking to estimate the remaining dose. 101.3 felt like the edge of something. The thermometer was in the glove box. I kept it there alongside a small flashlight and a box of baby wipes, and the car's owner's manual, which I had never read. I took Isaiah's temperature the same way I took it during his well visits. Ear canal, 3 seconds, 1 beep. He was half awake, running that particular temperature fog that kids run where they're not quite conscious but not quite asleep either, floating somewhere in between and too out of it to object to much of anything. 101.3. I looked at the number. I made myself think like a nurse for exactly 30 seconds. Running the decision tree. Temperature this high in a child this age with a respiratory illness requires evaluation, requires assessment for secondary infection, requires. And then I stopped making that list, because at the end of it was an ER copay I could not pay, and an antibiotic I could not fill, and a work shift that was starting in 3 hours that I could not afford to miss. I was out of children's Tylenol. I had been out since the previous night, but I have a habit, a bad one, or maybe a good one. I'm not sure of keeping the old bottles after they're empty in case there's residue, in case tilting the bottle at the right angle yields 2 more doses. I found the bottle at the bottom of my bag. Behind the wallet I'd stopped checking because looking at the number inside it didn't produce anything useful. I tipped it. I tipped it twice. I got enough for 1 dose, maybe? I gave it to Isaiah. He took it the way he took medicine, when he was running a fever passively, without objection, like his body had decided to conserve everything it had for the actual fighting. He swallowed it and put his head back against my shoulder, and I felt his temperature against my neck, that specific dry heat of a sick child, and I wrapped everything I had around him, which was my own body. At that point, since I'd already given him the jacket on night 2, and I sat in the driver's seat with him on my lap, and I held him, and I rocked him. Not dramatically, just the small, steady rocking you do without deciding to, because your body remembers it from before your children were old enough to tell you to stop. Back and forth, an inch each way, barely perceptible. The kind of movement that is really just a physical version of, I am here, I am here, I am here. At 5 in the morning, the fever broke. I felt it happen, the temperature shift that runs through a sick child when the body has won a round. He got slightly damp, and then slightly cooler, and then his breathing deepened into something less effortful. I held him for another 40 minutes after that, just to be certain. Then I moved him back to the rear seat, beside Nala, under everything I could layer. I did not sleep on night 6, not 1 minute. The 7th night was the one where I pulled up CPS on my phone. I need to explain what I mean when I say that, because I know what people hear when they hear it. I wasn't calling on myself. I wasn't at the point of surrender, or what I thought of as surrender at that time. I was doing what I do when I don't know what I'm walking into. I researched. I pulled up the Tennessee Department of Children's Services website, and I read the frequently asked questions section. I read the section on what triggers an investigation. I read the section on what happens to children during an investigation. I read the section on family support resources, which listed a phone number and a website and a 30 to 60 day processing timeline for emergency housing assistance. I read the whole thing in the parking lot at 11:30 at night with my phone brightness turned all the way down, the way you read something you don't want anyone else to see, even when no one is around. Then I sat with the phone in my hand and I thought about Zion. Not about myself, not about what it would mean for my file, my nursing license, my record as a mother that was, by every measure I could observe, imperfect but real. I thought about Zion sitting in a waiting room somewhere, watching a caseworker fill out forms with his name on them, watching doors, watching officials move through a hallway with the kind of authority that makes you small without trying. He would absorb everything, every form, every conversation he was meant to not hear, every face of every adult in the room. And he would carry it the way he carried everything else, silently, without complaint, without asking for help, forever. He was already carrying more than a 10-year-old should carry. He had been carrying it since the night he told me the parking lot was a nice camping spot and went to sleep to give me room to fall apart by myself. I was not going to add a waiting room to what he carried. I put the phone in the glove box next to the thermometer. I looked out the windshield. I said out loud, to nobody, to the parking lot, to the particular silence of a car where everyone is asleep. Okay, not that. What else? There was no answer. I didn't expect one. I was just checking to see if I had a question left in me. Because questions meant I was still moving. Questions meant I hadn't stopped. Day 7 was when I lost the job. Janet called me in at 10:15, in the middle of my shift. Her office had a window that looked out onto the parking structure, and she was standing beside it when I came in, not sitting behind her desk, which told me this wasn't an administrative conversation. It was a decision that had already been made. She said there had been some concerns. Not about my work, she was careful to say that, and I believe she meant it, and I hold on to that. Not about my patient care, not about my performance, about my appearance. Specifically, I had come in last Tuesday with my hair wet. I had looked, in the words of someone Janet did not name, but whose phrasing I recognize from the administrative vocabulary that gets used when a family member files a soft complaint. I had looked like I wasn't taking care of myself. I looked at her. I had been showering in the second-floor employee bathroom at 5:15 in the morning to make sure I looked presentable. My hair had been wet once because I hadn't had enough time between the shower and the shift to dry it completely. One time, my hair had been wet one time. Janet said she was going to ask me to take some time, unpaid, effective immediately, 2 weeks minimum, and then we'd reassess. I said, okay. She looked like she expected something else. Another word, maybe. A push, an explanation, a question. I said, I'll get my things. I went to the locker room. I took my scrubs out of my locker, the ones I'd left hanging there. The only backup set I hadn't been rotating through the sealed bag in the trunk. I folded them. I put them in my bag. I signed out at the front desk and walked to the employee parking structure, and I sat in the Honda for 45 minutes without moving. I did the math. Not the big math. I already knew the big math. And the big math produced 0 every time. The small math. Tonight, tomorrow, the day after. Quarter tank of gas. $18.70 in my wallet. No check coming for 2 weeks at minimum, assuming they reinstated me, which was an assumption I was not prepared to make. Then I drove to pick up Nala and Isaiah. I smiled at the woman at Isaiah's daycare. I asked how his day was. She said he'd had a good afternoon, better than yesterday, and I said that was great, that I was glad to hear it. I picked up Nala from the school pickup line, and Nala talked the whole way about a girl in her class named Destiny, who had braids that went all the way to her waist and could jump rope faster than anyone she had ever seen. I listened. I asked the right questions at the right intervals. That night at the church lot, I parked and I turned off the engine and I sat in the quiet and I thought, 8 nights. 8 nights, and I have $18.70 and no income, and a sick child and 2 other children who believe we are camping, and a 10-year-old who knows exactly what we are doing and is protecting me from his own knowledge of it. Nala and Isaiah were asleep by 9. Zion sat in the passenger seat for a while, the way he always did, watching the lot. Then he turned to face me. He was holding something. The $20 bill I kept in the zippered inner pocket of my purse. The emergency bill, the one that exists. So there is always a last resort. The one I had shown him once when he was 8 and told him, this is for real emergencies only. Never touch it, not for anything. He was holding it in both hands, flat, the way you hold something you've been careful with. I found it when I was looking for a wipe, he said. I didn't spend it. I looked at the $20 bill in my son's hands. I have a rule. I made it on the first night in the parking lot, and I have kept it every night since. I do not cry in front of my children. Not because I think there's something wrong with crying in front of children. I know there isn't. I know it teaches them that emotion is survivable. I know all of that. I don't do it because if I start, I don't know when I'd stop. And I need to be the person in this car who doesn't stop. I took the $20. I held it. I folded it once and put it in my pocket. Then I reached across the center console and I pulled Zion toward me. And I held him the way I'd held Isaiah at 3 a.m. with the fever, not dramatically, not with anything to say, just with my arms around him and my chin on top of his head, and the specific weight of a child who is too old to be held like this, but who is not pulled back. He said into my shoulder, "We're gonna be okay, Mom." I said, "I know, baby." I didn't know. I had $20 and a quarter tank of gas, and an unpaid suspension, and a sick child, and 8 nights behind us, and nothing I could see in front of us. But I said it like I meant it, and I held him until he was ready to let go. Day 9 started in a Kroger parking lot, not because I was shopping. Because Kroger on Summer Avenue opened at 6 a.m. and had a bathroom I could take 3 children to in the morning, and a lobby that was warm, and a security presence that was passive rather than active. The kind that keeps an eye on things without approaching a woman and her kids unless something specific happens. I had learned, over 8 days, the difference between these types of public spaces. Libraries were the best. Warm, quiet, staffed by people whose professional instinct was to offer rather than remove. McDonald's had the longest acceptable dwell time per dollar spent. Grocery stores had the bathrooms. We sat in the Kroger lobby for 45 minutes. While Zion did homework on his phone, he had downloaded his worksheets before the car and worked through them in the back seat. Most evenings. And Nala drew in her sketchbook, and Isaiah ate the last of the granola bars and watched the automatic doors open and close with the focused attention of a 3-year-old who has found something fascinating and intends to extract every bit of entertainment it contained. I had $20 and a quarter tank of gas. I had a suspended job I didn't know if I'd get back. I had 3 children who thought we were on an adventure that was almost over. I bought one thing at Kroger, a small bottle of children's ibuprofen, $5.49 from the generic shelf. Different mechanism than the Tylenol. Better for fever reduction in children Isaiah's age. I put it in my bag next to the thermometer, and I did not think about what it said about my planning horizon that I was buying medicine instead of food. We drove to the public library on Peabody for the morning. Nala checked out 2 books, including one about butterflies, with photographs so detailed she sat in a chair for an hour, not drawing, just looking. Isaiah fell asleep in the corner beanbag that the children's section kept for exactly this purpose. A large blue oval of worn corduroy that Isaiah had been calling the Big Egg across several visits to different library branches over the last week. Zion found a table near the window and worked until the battery on his tablet died, and then he sat and looked out the window at Peabody Avenue with the particular stillness of a child who has learned to wait without requiring anything from the waiting. I sat across from him. I did not pretend to read. I just sat, at some point in the middle of that morning, with my son across the table and my daughter absorbed in a book about monarch butterflies, and my youngest asleep in a blue bean bag, shaped like an egg in the specific quiet of a public library, where no one was asking anything of anyone. I allowed myself to feel, briefly, what I had been keeping in a separate room in my mind for 9 days. Not grief, exactly. Something without a cleaner name. The particular weight of doing everything right and arriving, anyway, at a place that looked like failure. I let myself feel it for 7 minutes. Then I put it back in the room. I had a problem to solve, and feeling things about it was not solving it. By 3 in the afternoon, I had made 4 phone calls. A nonprofit housing helpline that was backed up 3 weeks on appointments. A church outreach program that had a waiting list. The social work department at Memphis Regional, which I called because I had worked alongside those social workers for 2 years and believed, correctly, that someone there would know something I didn't about emergency resources. The social worker, I reached a woman named April, who I'd seen in the hallways for months without ever really talking to, stayed on the phone with me for 20 minutes. She gave me 2 names and 3 numbers. She said, "Call the second number first. They move faster." I called the second number. It went to voicemail. I left a message. By 6 p.m., I had not heard back. I drove to the church on Lamar as the sky went dark. Same lot, same back corner, close enough to the street to feel less isolated. The routine by now was automatic. Engine off, blankets redistributed, Zion to the passenger seat, the bear story. This time, the bear was trying to build a treehouse and kept dropping things, and then the measured exit of consciousness as the younger 2 went down, one at a time. Nala first, and then Isaiah just behind her. Zion was asleep before 10. The fever had been gone for 3 days. His breathing was even. I sat. The night was clear and cold. The kind of Memphis cold that arrives in late September and reminds you that what felt like enough, the jacket, the blankets, the engine heat in intervals, was enough for fall and would not be enough for what was coming. November was 5 weeks away. I did not allow myself to think past November, because past November was the kind of thinking that produced 0 without the possibility of solution, and I had learned to only run equations that had a chance of a different answer. I had $14.51 left after the ibuprofen, a quarter tank of gas. At 11:47, I heard 3 taps on the driver's side window. I want to tell you about the specific way CJ crossed that parking lot, because it matters, and I've been thinking about it since. He didn't come straight at the car. He came at an angle. The same angle you take in a hospital room when you're approaching a patient who might be frightened, who needs to see your approach before you're close enough to be a threat. You come from the side, so you're visible for longer. You don't appear suddenly. CJ came at that angle without, I'm certain, knowing the clinical reason for it. He just knew, from something in his own experience, that a woman alone in a car at midnight needed to see him coming before he arrived. He stopped 6 feet back, both hands up, palms out. I cracked the window. What he said, you already know. You know it because I told you at the beginning of this story, and I told you there because it's the sentence I will be thinking about for the rest of my life. What I haven't told you is what I was doing while he said it. I was reading him. I do this for a living. I have been doing it in clinical contexts for 6 years and in survival contexts for 9 days. And what you learn across both of those applications is that a body tells the truth even when words don't. His hands were steady, not the controlled steadiness of someone managing fear, which tightens the tendons around the wrists, but natural steady. His weight was evenly distributed, not shifted to one foot the way people shift when they want to leave or when they're uncertain. He wasn't scanning the car for something to assess. He was looking at me. Just me. The way you look at someone when you're trying to understand them rather than manage them. He was not frightened of me. He was not performing. He was not going to call anyone. He was just waiting. I told him 9 nights. He asked if I had somewhere to go tomorrow. I said no. He said, "Give me a few minutes." He turned and walked back to the black SUV near the church entrance, the one I had noticed when I pulled in, but filed as irrelevant. He opened the rear door and leaned in. I watched the conversation I couldn't hear through the windshield. 4 minutes, maybe 5. Then he came back. He stopped at the same distance as before. His hands were at his sides this time, loose, easy. He said, "My employer would like to offer you and your children a room at the Peabody for 90 days while you get back on your feet. No conditions, no contracts, no strings attached, just 90 days of solid ground." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, "I'm not taking charity from a stranger. I meant it." This is the thing I need you to understand. It wasn't pride in the way people sometimes say. Pride as if it's a flaw to overcome. Pride was the operating system of my survival. Pride was what got me to work every morning with my hair still damp from the employee shower and kept my voice bright for the bear story and made me fold my emergency $20 back into my pocket instead of using it on the granola. Bars I couldn't afford to replace. Pride was the difference between a woman who was handling an impossible situation and a situation that had swallowed a woman whole. If I gave up pride, I wasn't sure what was left. CJ listened to me say I wasn't taking charity. He nodded like he had expected this. Then he said, "It's not charity. My mother was in a car like this once. So was his." He tilted his head back slightly toward the SUV. "We're not giving you something. We're giving back something that was given to us." Somebody stopped for us. Once. We stop when we see it. I sat with that. Isaiah moved behind me a small shift, a settling, and then the slight wet sound of his breathing that had been there since night 4. Better than it was, but not gone. I looked at him in the rearview mirror, 3 years old, still in my jacket, over his blankets, still coughing sometimes at night. I looked at the passenger seat. Zion was asleep, head against the window, making that small cloud of breath on the glass that appeared and faded, appeared and faded. My son, who had been lying on my behalf for 9 nights, who had found the emergency $20 while looking for a wipe, and brought it to me with both hands, like something precious. He was 10 years old. He was in the passenger seat of a car in a church parking lot in Memphis at midnight, and he was doing his best, and he had been doing his best for a very long time. I reached for the door handle. Pride is survival. But survival is also knowing when you have run as far as you can on one engine, and something has to change or the engine fails. The children did not care about my pride. Isaiah needed a warm room. Zion needed 9 hours of sleep without listening for danger. Nala needed to return her library book on Thursday because she had library day, and she cared about that with the complete sincerity of a 7-year-old for whom that Thursday was the entire world. I opened the door. I stepped out into the cold of a September midnight on Lamar Avenue in Memphis, Tennessee, in the best scrubs I had left, and the navy puffer that was someone else's warmth first before it was mine. I had $14.51 and a quarter tank of gas, and 9 nights behind me and 3 children inside that car who had never once stopped believing I knew what I was doing. I walked across the parking lot. CJ was 2 steps behind me, not beside me, giving me space to cover the distance at my own pace. The black SUV's rear window was visible, a shape in the back seat. I reached the door. CJ opened it. The man inside was in his 50s. He was dressed like someone who had been in meetings all day, jacket still on, the kind of quiet, expensive that doesn't announce itself. He looked at me the way CJ had looked at me, directly, waiting, like what I said next was going to be taken seriously and not processed through a layer of translation. He said, "My mother was a nurse. Not thank you for talking to us. Not we're so glad we could help. Not any of the sentences I had prepared a defense for. My mother was a nurse." I stood there in the cold, with the door open and the interior light on, and 9 nights behind me, and I said, "So am I." He nodded, and then he said 3 more sentences that I was not prepared for, that I will tell you about when I tell you about Solomon Adeyemi, who he was, why CJ stopped, and what his mother's hands had to do with any of it. I grew up in Chicago. My mother worked with what she had, and it was never enough. I have spent 30 years trying to make sure other people don't have to work that same math. He said them evenly, without emotion. The way you say something true that you have said before and have stopped needing to perform. Then he waited. That was it. No speech about generosity. No framing about what he expected in return. He had told me exactly what he wanted me to know, and then he had stopped talking, which is something most people cannot do, and which told me more about him than the 3 sentences themselves did. I said, "Okay," he nodded. He told me someone would meet us at the front entrance. He said there would be a key, and 2 connecting rooms and meals could be charged to the room for the duration. He used the word duration the way people use words when they have lawyers in their lives who have made precision a habit, and I filed that. CJ drove us to the Peabody at 12:20 in the morning. I want to tell you what it was like to walk into that hotel with 3 children at midnight, one asleep over my shoulder and two walking beside me, all of us in 9-day-old versions of our best clothes. The lobby of the Peabody is the kind of space that was designed to announce itself: high ceilings, marble floors, the specific ambient hum of a place that has housed people who expect a certain quality of air. A man at the front desk looked up when we came through the door. He looked at CJ. He looked at me. He looked at my children. Then he looked back at his screen and began typing. And I understood from that specific sequence of looks that he had been told we were coming and had been told not to make a thing of it. He handed me 2 keycards without ceremony. Room 814 connected to 815. We rode the elevator in silence. Isaiah was asleep against my shoulder, heavier than he had been on night 1 children. Gain weight when they're fed consistently. And I had been consistent about that, if nothing else. Nala held the edge of my sleeve, the way she did in unfamiliar places. Zion carried his backpack and stood in the corner of the elevator and watched the numbers change. I opened the door to room 814. The carpet was thick, the bed was made. There was a window that looked out over 2nd Avenue. The city lights scattered across the glass like something accidental. The air was warm, not car warm, not the temporary warmth of an engine that would stop and be replaced by cold, but the steady, managed warmth of a building that heated itself and would continue to heat itself regardless of what was happening outside. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Nala went directly to the bed nearest the window, peeled back the comforter, and was asleep inside of 8 minutes. I put Isaiah down beside her, removed his shoes, covered both of them. I stood there watching them breathe for longer than was necessary. Because I could. Because I was in a room where watching them breathe was not also watching for other things. Zion sat on the edge of the second bed. He set his backpack on the floor beside it. He looked around the room with the careful deliberation of a 10-year-old who has learned that assessing a situation fully before responding to it is a form of self-protection. Then he looked at me. "Are we allowed to be here?" "Yes," I said. "For how long?" 90 days. He thought about this. And then we'll have figured something out." He nodded. He opened his backpack. He took out his tablet and the homework he had printed at the library, and he turned on the bedside lamp, and he started working. I sat in the chair by the window, and I watched the city, and I let myself, for the first time since the lock clicked on the door of the apartment on Fraser Boulevard, stop running the math. Just for 20 minutes. Just to see what the inside of a room felt like when it was only a room and not also a survival calculation. Isaiah cried for 2 nights. Not from cold or hunger or fever, those things were managed, and I will come to that. He cried from unfamiliarity, which is a thing that happens to small children when the environment changes faster than their nervous systems can process. He had lived in that car for 9 nights. He had learned the sounds of it. The specific way the metal contracted in the cold. The particular quality of the light at different hours. The smell of his siblings beside him. Now there was different carpet and different air, and a bathroom with a door, and a window with curtains that moved slightly when the heating came on. He was 3. He didn't have language for why any of that was frightening. He just knew it was different. I held him through both of those nights without needing to keep one eye on the mirrors. Nala slept for 14 hours the first day. I know because I checked on her 4 times, each time finding her in exactly the same position, and the 4th time I pressed my hand to her forehead just to feel normal skin temperature rather than the slightly elevated warmth she'd been carrying since night 3. She slept like someone who had been awake for 9 nights and had finally been given permission to stop. The second morning of the 90 days, CJ drove Isaiah and me to a pediatric clinic. The doctor took one look at his ears and said, "Bilateral otitis media," which is medical for ear infection in both ears. Which was why the cough had been pulling at that particular depth in his chest, because the fluid pressure was affecting his eustachian tubes and creating a postnasal drip. The prescription was amoxicillin. $14 at the Walgreens across from the clinic. CJ paid for it before I could calculate whether I had $14. I told him I would pay him back. He said, "Sure." He said it in the tone of someone who had no expectation of repayment and was simply being polite about not arguing. And I understood that arguing would cost me more energy than I had available, so I thanked him and put the antibiotic in my bag, and we drove back to the hotel. On the fourth day of the 90, I applied to 2 LPN positions, one at a freestanding urgent care on Union Avenue, one at the affiliated outpatient clinic attached to Memphis Regional, smaller than the hospital, focused on primary and transitional care. Better scheduling. I submitted both applications the same afternoon from the desk in room 814 while Nala drew at the table and Zion read. 4 days later, the affiliated clinic called. I went in for the interview on a Thursday, in a clean set of scrubs I had washed in the hotel sink and dried over the shower rod. I was called back the following Monday. Better hours. Same base pay. Benefits after 90 days. A supervisor named Denise, who shook my hand with the specific firmness of someone who has interviewed many nurses and uses the handshake as part of the assessment. I started the following week. Solomon I understood in pieces, because that is how he offered himself. Not a presentation of his story, but fragments that emerged in context. Each one connected to something specific in our conversation, rather than to a planned disclosure. He came to the hotel twice in the first 30 days, and both times he talked the way CJ talked directly, without performance, without the careful management of impression that I associated with wealth, and the particular self-consciousness that usually accompanies it. I found out about his mother the same way I found out most things during those 90 days, in pieces when they were relevant. Her name was Falake. She had come to Chicago from Lagos in 1989 with a nursing degree that American hospitals would not recognize, and a son who was 4 years old, and a specific kind of determination that, from the way Solomon described it, was not optimism, but something more durable than optimism, closer to refusal. She worked as a home health aide for 6 years before her credentials were recognized, and she worked those years with the same precision and care she would have brought to the clinical work, because she was a nurse, regardless of what the American licensing system was prepared to call her. When Solomon was 8 years old, a landlord in their neighborhood took their security deposit and disappeared with it, and Falaki could not cover first month's rent on what a home health aide made, and they spent 21 nights in a parking lot in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Chicago, in an Oldsmobile that was older than the neighborhood. She drove him to school every morning from that parking lot. She braided his hair in the front seat using a comb she kept in the glove box. She made him promise not to tell anyone. He never forgot. He told me this on the second visit, at a small table in the hotel lobby, over coffee that I was paying for now because I had a paycheck coming in 10 days, and I had made it a rule for myself that I was not going to be on the receiving end of generosity. I couldn't eventually begin reciprocating, even in the small way of a cup of coffee. He said it without looking for a reaction. He said it the way you say something that happened long enough ago that you have made your peace with most of it, but not all of it. And the part that remains unpieced is just something you carry. His wife Tamara had been a nurse. She had died 3 years ago. Cancer. She had spent her career, and the volunteer hours alongside it, working in exactly the spaces where women like his mother and women like me existed. The spaces where care was needed most and resources were thinnest. When she was gone, Solomon had kept writing checks to the organizations she had supported, because that was the form of continuation he knew how to do. CJ had been doing something else. He'd been stopping. Solomon found out about it 6 months before the night in the church parking lot. CJ had told him not as a confession, as a simple statement of fact that he had developed a habit over 3 years of driving, of pulling over when he saw fogged windows in a parking lot at night. He knocked on the driver's side window. He raised his hands. He asked how long. I figure if one person had stopped for my mother once, CJ had told Solomon, she might not have given up hoping. So I stop. Every time I see it. Solomon had looked at his driver of 6 years and understood in that moment something he hadn't fully understood about his own checks and organizations and carefully managed philanthropy. He understood that memory is not enough. Memory requires action to stay alive. And the action Amara had modeled, sitting with the person, asking the specific question, stopping the car, was not something that happened from a board meeting. It happened from a driver's seat. On the 29th day, I knocked on the door of room 815. I knocked because Isaiah had been crying for 45 minutes, not the ear infection cry, not the unfamiliar room cry, something new, something that I had diagnosed correctly as loneliness and overstimulation and the accumulated weight of 30 days of change that he did not have words for. And I needed another adult to be in the room with me for 5 minutes, not to help, not to solve it, just to be there. The woman who opened the door was 28 years old. She had a son on her hip, roughly Isaiah's age, who was eating a cracker with the focused solemnity of a child for whom crackers require full attention. She looked at me. She looked at Isaiah on my hip, still making the sound that was a step below crying. She stepped back from the door. She said, "Come in. I'll put the kettle on." Her name was Keturah Williams. She had left a situation in East Memphis 9 weeks before, with her son Damon and a bag and a bruise on her left wrist that had taken 4 weeks to go fully yellow and then gone. The same organization that had connected Solomon's resources to families in acute need had placed her in room 815 the week after I arrived in 814. We talked until 2 in the morning. Not about everything. There is a specific category of thing that takes longer to say out loud than 2 people in a hotel room at 2 a.m. have time for. But we talked about the things that were immediate and practical and needed to be talked about by someone who understood them, which meant someone who was also doing them. The forms, the wait lists, the specific math of a household income that is real but not enough, and how to find the line between programs you are eligible for and programs you are not, and what to do when you are not quite poor enough for the floor-level assistance and not anywhere near prosperous enough for anything else. She was enrolled in a CNA certification program at Southwest Tennessee Community College. She studied at night after Damon went to sleep, with her textbooks open on the room's desk under the lamp. I split my food stamps with her for the last week of the month, because hers had run out and mine hadn't, and because the arithmetic of generosity, when you are both at the bottom, is different from the arithmetic of generosity when you have more. $50 is a large amount when you are giving it from $40. On the Sunday of week 11, we sat together at the desk in room 814, and we filled out apartment applications for 3 different workforce housing complexes in Memphis, while we shared the printer I had borrowed from the hotel business center on the 2nd floor. We checked each other's work the way you check someone's work when the stakes of a small error are larger than they should be. On day 87, my phone rang at 9:47 inches the morning. Housing office, Midtown area. A 2-bedroom unit in a workforce housing building on McNeil Street. Move in October 15th. Deposit $400, covered by the program. My share of the first month's rent, $220. I had $247 in my account. For the first time in 4 months, the math worked. Not generously, not with room to spare, but worked. I sat on the edge of the bed and held my phone for a long time. Then I called the housing office back and I said, "I'll take it." I signed the lease on a Wednesday afternoon. And on the drive back to the hotel, the same route, the same streets, I had driven from the hospital every night for 2 years. And then from the church lot for 9 nights, I thought about Solomon Adeyemi and about something he had said on his second visit that I hadn't fully understood at the time and that I understood now in the way you understand things when the context has caught up to the sentence. He had said, "Amara would have known your name before the end of the first conversation." I had thanked him. I hadn't known what he meant. Pulling into the Peabody parking structure on the Wednesday, I signed my lease. I understood. And what I understood changed the shape of everything I had thought I knew about why any of this had happened. Thought for 2M22S. When I told Zion we had a home, he made a face I had never seen before. Not happiness. Exactly, I know what Zion's happiness looks like, and it is quiet, contained, a slight loosening around his eyes. Not relief either, though there was some of that. What crossed his face in the 2 seconds after I said the words was something I had to think about for a while before I could name it. Then I named it permission. The specific expression of a child who has been holding something for so long that when someone finally says you can put it down now, the face has to reorganize itself around the concept of putting it down. He put it down. Right there in the hotel room, with his tablet open to unfinished math work, and Nala coloring at the table, and Isaiah putting crackers in and out of a plastic cup, for reasons only he understood. He nodded. He turned back to his math. He didn't whoop. He didn't ask questions. He just put it down and kept moving, the way he had learned to keep moving, and I sat on the edge of the bed and watched him and thought he should not have had to carry that. He should not have known what carrying it felt like. That is the thing I will spend the longest time making peace with. Not the 9 nights, not the job, not the math that didn't work for 4 months. The 10-year-old face making the expression of someone who has finally been given permission to stop pretending. I told Solomon about that face on day 89. He came to the hotel on a Thursday afternoon in the last week of the 90. Not his assistant Solomon himself, which I had learned over 11 weeks was his particular way of marking something as important. He sent an assistant for things that were logistical. He came himself for things that weren't. He found me in the lobby. Coffee for him, sweet tea for me, a small table near the window that looked out onto 2nd Avenue, the same stretch of city that my room's window had looked out on for 11 weeks, and that I still found slightly unreal in the way that temporary good things remain slightly unreal until they become permanent. He asked how I was doing. He asked the way CJ had asked in the parking lot specifically, with the implication that fine was not an acceptable category of answer. So I told him the truth. The lease. The LPN position at the affiliated clinic. Keturah studying at her kitchen table. 3 floors below me in the new building. Zion's face. When I said, "We have a home." He listened the same way his mother had apparently listened, which I knew from what he'd told me. Without interrupting, watching the speaker's face for what lived behind the words. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he told me about Tamara. He had told me the facts of her, that she was a nurse, that she died 3 years ago, that she had volunteered. He had told me those facts the way you tell facts, when the full story is too large, and you're still deciding how much of it the other person needs. Now he told me the rest. Tamara had volunteered every Thursday evening at a family shelter in Midtown. Not in the medical capacity, she was past the point in her career where she needed to volunteer for nursing experience, but in the specific capacity of someone who understood what the families in that shelter needed beyond medical care. She read picture books to the children. That was her Thursday evening, for 11 years. She sat in a corner of the shelter's family room, and she read picture books in the particular voice she used for it, which was apparently a voice that her patients at the hospital would have recognized because it was the same one she used at bedside when she needed a child to stop being frightened long enough to let her help. She read until her voice was hoarse. Every Thursday for 11 years, when she was dying, the cancer that took 14 months from the first scan to the last morning, the thing that made her cry was not what Solomon had expected it to be. He had braced himself for conversations about their life together, about things left unsaid, about the particular grief of a marriage ending before the marriage was supposed to end. Those conversations happened. But what made her cry, in the 3rd to last week, lying in a hospital bed in the room they had converted from a study on the 2nd floor of their house because she had decided she was not going back to the hospital. What made her cry was the thought of the Thursday children. Who's going to read to them? She said. Someone has to read to them. Solomon told her he would find someone. He said it the way you say things when the person you love is frightened, and you would say anything to take the frightened thing away. He meant it. He went and found organizations and wrote checks to them, and he told himself that was finding someone. He looked at his coffee. It was not finding someone, he said. I wrote the checks. I attended the board meetings of the organizations she cared about. I put her name on a room at the shelter. I did all the things that look like keeping a promise, and that are not keeping the promise. He paused. CJ was keeping it. He had been keeping it for 3 years, without knowing that's what he was doing. When he told me why he stopped, I understood that what Amara had meant was not the checks. It was the stopping. I held my glass of sweet tea. I looked at the table. Maybe she meant stop the car, I said. He looked at me. I had not planned to say it. It arrived the way some things do, already formed, already true, just waiting for the right moment to be said out loud. I had been thinking about Amara since he first mentioned her name, because there is a specific gravity that a dead nurse has for a living nurse, a pull toward understanding who she was and how she worked and why it mattered. Maybe the Thursday children were the car. Maybe Amara had been telling you for 11 years, this is what I stop for. This is the thing I see that I cannot walk past. And maybe when she asked you to find someone, she was saying, find someone the way I found it. Not with money, by stopping. The lobby was quiet around us. The midday hour after the checkout rush, before the afternoon arrivals. A few people moving across the marble floor at the far end. The ambient hum of a large building doing what large buildings do. Solomon sat with what I'd said for a while. Then he said, she would have liked you. I said, you told me that once. You said, Amara would have known my name before the end of the first conversation? I did. I've been thinking about what it means. What does it mean to you? I thought about it. It means she saw people before they had to prove they were worth seeing. It means she didn't wait for someone to earn the picture book. She just read. He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, my mother is 78. She lives in Chicago, in the same neighborhood where we slept in the car. I knew about the car he had told me in an earlier visit. The fragments of his own origin. Falaki, Hyde Park, 21 nights. A comb from the glove box. She still lives there, he said. Same block. She could afford to live anywhere. She stays because she says the neighborhood is where she learned what matters, and she does not want to forget. Is she well? She is exactly herself, he said, which is the only version of well that matters. He told me what his mother used to say to him, about the people who cleaned the rooms and changed the bandages, and sat with the dying, that those were the people who held the world together, and that he should never forget them. He said it the way you say something you have been saying inside your own head for so long that you're almost surprised to hear it come out in your own voice, rather than in the voice of the person who first said it to you. I said, you flew to see her? I'm flying tomorrow. He looked at me. I need to tell her about you. About CJ. About all of it. She needs to know that the thing she built in me is still that it's still going. That it didn't die with Amara. I did not have a response to that. I sat with it the same way he had sat with maybe she meant stop the car. Letting it occupy the space it needed without rushing to fill the space with words. He flew to Chicago on a Friday morning. I moved into the apartment on McNeil Street the following Saturday. Keturah helped me carry things up the stairs, and her son Damon carried an empty grocery bag with enormous seriousness, as though it were something fragile. Zion organized the kitchen cabinets with a system he designed himself and explained to me in careful detail because he intended to maintain it and required my cooperation. Nala chose which wall would be for her drawings, and she chose the wall beside the window in the room the two of them would share, because she said the light was better for color. Isaiah walked from room to room and touched everything. On the following Monday, my phone rang at 11 in the morning. Solomon, calling from Chicago. His voice had something in it I had not heard before. Not emotion exactly, but the residue of it, the quality of a voice that has been in a significant conversation and is still carrying the weight of what was said. He told me that his mother had something she wanted me to know. He repeated her words exactly, and I knew he was repeating them exactly because they had the specific rhythm of words that someone has asked you to carry intact. Tell that young woman she did nothing wrong. She kept her children fed and safe and warm with her own body for 9 nights. That is not failure. That is what mothers do. That is what we have always done. Tell her she is standing in a line of women who did exactly what she did, who gave what they had and kept going. Tell her she is not the beginning of that line, and she is not the end of it. I was standing at the kitchen window of my new apartment. The wall beside me was still bare. Nala's drawings hadn't gone up yet. The morning light came through at an angle that reminded me, briefly, of something I had lost, and then reminded me that I was standing somewhere new, and the light came through differently here, and that was not a lesser thing. I said, "Tell her thank you." Solomon said, "She knows. The badge is on the counter every morning before I leave. I put it there the night before, so I don't have to look for it in the morning, because I am a person who loses things when I'm half asleep, and I cannot afford to be the nurse who arrives at her shift without her badge." It reads, Tamara Reeves, LPN, Memphis Regional Medical Center Outpatient Clinic. The laminate is starting to lift at one corner from the number of times I've clipped and unclipped it. I will get a new one eventually. For now, I press the corner back down every morning with my thumbnail, which never works, but which I do anyway. This is what a year looks like. Coffee made by 6. Zion's lunch packed the night before, in the insulated bag he chose himself at Target dark blue, with a clip that closes too loudly, which he is aware of, and does anyway. Isaiah's backpack by the door, the small one with the dinosaurs on it, that he picked, because the biggest dinosaur on it looked, in his words, like it's laughing, which it does not. But he is 4 now, and 4 has its own logic. Nala's drawings cover the wall beside her window, the one she chose specifically for the light, and they have been going up one at a time since the week we moved in, overlapping at the edges, pinned with the same Dollar General alphabet magnets from the boxes we packed from Fraser Boulevard and carried to the car, and carried from the car to the hotel, and carried from the hotel to McNeil Street, because I keep things that work until they stop working. The children sleep through most of my morning routine. I have calibrated the sounds of it, coffee maker, cabinet, keys to a volume and sequence that doesn't penetrate the specific depth of the sleep that 7 and 10 and 4-year-olds sleep when they have a bed in a warm room and they're not listening for anything. Isaiah's breathing, when I check on him before I leave, sounds like nothing, which is to say, it sounds the way healthy breathing sounds: undemanding, effortless, unremarkable, the kind of breathing you don't notice, which is the whole point. For 9 nights in November, I counted it. Now, I just lay a hand on his back for 2 seconds and go. 8 months into the LPN position at the affiliated clinic, I was offered a full-time contract with benefits. I signed it on a Tuesday afternoon in the same break room where I heat up my lunch every day, on the same table where Denise had set the paperwork, with the same pen I use for everything, which is a blue Bic I keep in my bag, because I have always used blue Bic pens, and I see no reason to change. Benefits means my children have insurance. This is not a small thing. I will not say it is a small thing. 3 floors below me, in the same building on McNeil Street, Keturah Williams has a 2-bedroom unit with a kitchen window that I can see from the parking lot when her light is on at night. Her light is on most nights. She studies at her kitchen table after Damon goes to sleep. Flashcards, printed diagrams, her textbooks open to sections she has flagged with the small colored tabs I recognize, because I used the same system when I went through the CNA program myself, years ago, before the additional training, before Memphis Regional. She is in her 3rd semester of the LPN program at Southwest Tennessee. Her son started kindergarten this fall, at the same school as Isaiah. She told me once, in the elevator on a Thursday evening, that she had almost quit in the first month. Not because the coursework was too hard, but because her own voice, in her own head, was telling her she didn't belong there. That people like her didn't do things like this, didn't become nurses, didn't move from a hotel room to a building with their own lease to a professional program all in the space of a year. I told her, I used to eat oatmeal for dinner 3 nights a week so the math would work. My kids thought they were camping for 9 nights in a parking lot. She looked at me. I said, you belong there. Go to class. She went to class. Solomon called me one more time after the Monday with Falake's message. He called to tell me about the visit, not everything, because some things between a mother and a son belong to the kitchen table where they happened and not to the phone call that comes after. But enough. He told me she had hugged him at the door. Both arms, full grip, the hug of a woman who had spent too many decades of long shifts to take the physical fact of a person in front of her for granted. He told me she had held her ginger tea in both hands the whole time he spoke, and that her reading glasses had been pushed up on her forehead the way they always were when she wasn't reading. He said she looked exactly the way she always looked, like a woman who had decided a long time ago to outlast everything the world could throw at her through sheer refusal to sit down. He told me what she had said about memory, not the message she had sent to me, the thing she had said to him directly, looking at him across the table, her fingers thin and warm around his hand. We are people who remember, Solomon. That's what I gave you. Not wealth, not opportunity memory. The memory of what it's like to need help and not have it. And the choice, every single day, to make sure someone else doesn't have to carry that same memory alone. He told me she had squeezed his hand at the end of it and said, now finish your tea. It's getting cold. I laughed when he told me that. A real laugh. The kind that catches you off guard. And Solomon laughed too, the particular laugh of two people who are laughing because something is true, not because it's funny. There is something I want to say before I tell you about the Tuesday morning in March. CJ did not save me. Solomon did not save me. The 90 days at the Peabody were not salvation. They were 90 days of standing on ground that wasn't moving while I figured out what came next. There is a difference between being rescued and being given enough stability to rescue yourself, and I need that difference to be clear because the story I am telling you is not a story about a good man with money and a driver with a conscience. It is a story about 90 days of believing that I was worth standing on solid ground. I had always been worth it. That was not in question. What was in question was whether anyone else knew it, which is a different kind of question, and one that matters in ways that are painful to admit. You can know your own worth all day long and still be drowning in a parking lot because the world has decided you're invisible. What CJ did was see me. What Solomon did was say, here is time. What Falake gave Solomon, and what Solomon gave me, was not a solution. It was the memory of their own specific need, held close enough that when they saw it in someone else, they couldn't walk past it. That's all. That's the whole mechanism. I don't know Falake Adeyemi. We have never met. But I carry her words the way you carry something, given to you by a person who understood exactly what weight you were holding and chose the right thing to say to it. She said I was standing in a line of women. She said I was not the beginning and not the end. She was right. It was a Tuesday morning in early March, 5:45. I took Lamar Avenue because I always take Lamar, because I have been taking Lamar since before the 9 nights and through the 9 nights and after them. And by now, it is the road that makes the most sense to me, not the fastest, not the most direct, but the one I know, the way you know a road you have covered in multiple kinds of weather and more than one kind of need. The streets were empty, streetlights still on, turning the wet asphalt orange in patches. The radio was playing low, something instrumental, something that asked nothing of me. I passed the gas station on Lamar. I passed the Shell, where a black SUV had once sat while a man inside it decided whether to cross the street. I slowed down as I passed the church, Greater Hope Baptist. The sign out front said, "All are welcome." In the parking lot, near the back, a car sat alone. An old sedan. The windows were fogged. Not the light mist you get from temperature difference, but the deep, settled condensation of air that has been breathed inside a closed space for hours. I know what that fog looks like. I know exactly what produces it. I pulled to the curb. I turned off the engine. I sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel. The sky at the edges of the east was beginning to show the first gray-blue of early March morning, the color the sky gets right before it commits to daylight. My scrubs were clean. My badge was on my chest. I was 5 minutes from my shift and 45 minutes from the first patient of the day. And there was a car in that parking lot with fogged windows and shapes visible through the glass. I thought about a man standing in this same lot with his hands raised and his palms open. I thought about what he asked, and why he asked it that way, and what it cost him to walk across a parking lot at midnight to knock on a stranger's window. I thought about Katura's kitchen light on at 11 p.m. over flashcards. I thought about Zion's face making the expression of permission. I thought about Nala's drawings on the wall beside the window she chose for the light. I thought about Falake, 78 years old, in a kitchen in Hyde Park, Chicago, telling her son, "We are people who remember." I opened the car door. The March air in Memphis is cool at that hour. Not cold. Not the cold of 9 nights in November, but cool enough to feel. The parking lot asphalt was still wet from rain the night before. My shoes were quiet on it. My badge caught the edge of a streetlight briefly as I crossed. I reached the car. I stood beside the driver's window. Through the fog, I could make out shapes at least 2, maybe more. I could hear breathing. I raised my hand. I knocked 3 times. Not aggressive, deliberate. The way you knock when you want someone to know you are there, but not to be afraid of the fact of you. I stepped back 2 feet, and I put my hands up, palms out, so that whoever was inside could see them before I was close enough to be a threat. The window cracked, 1 inch. Eyes looking out at me. A woman. Exhausted, frightened, holding it together, the way you hold it together, when holding it together is the last thing you have left, I said. I'm not asking if you're okay. I can see you're not okay. I paused. I'm asking how long. Before you close this one question, and I mean it as a real one, has anyone ever stopped for you? Not asked, are you okay? But how long the question that assumes the real answer? Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story moved something in you, share it. Because somewhere in your city right now there is a car with fogged windows in a parking lot. And inside it is a person who is holding it together and who needs to know that the knock is coming. It is always coming. Because kindness doesn't expire. It compounds.